The Office for Victims of Crimes estimates that 30% of Americans will be involved in an alcohol-related accident at some point in their lifetime. Because of that, it is not only important to know what you do if you are a victim of a drunk driving accident, but also to understand your legal rights so that you do not become a victim twice. My guest today is North Carolina personal injury attorney Michael A. DeMayo of the law offices of Michael A. DeMayo, and he's going to talk with us about this topic. So Michael, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Cindy.
Well, Michael, what are some of the biggest legal challenges associated with handling a drunk driving claim?
Well, generally, Cindy, obviously from a factual scenario, you always have to determine liability in any situation, but ultimately when you add the component of drinking and driving, usually for us to be successful on the punitive aspect of the claim, which is dealing with an additional form of compensation or punishment or deterrence, you do have to prove that the defendant was in fact beyond the legal limit, which in our state is .08.
Well, Michael, if someone is driving drunk, obviously they have liability if they hit and injure another person. But what about if that drunk driver had just left a public bar where they had consumed the alcohol that led to the drunken state? Now, does that make the bar owner liable as well?
It depends. The answer to that question is it depends. You're asking about something called social host liability, or in that instance, actually not social host liability, but it'd be premises liability dealing with a particular establishment. They do have a duty and an obligation to not overserve or serve someone who is obviously intoxicated, and they do have an obligation to see that person has another option. But if the person refuses their help, unfortunately, oftentimes that will absolve the restaurant owner or bar of liability. They're called dram shop laws, and they're continuously developing in the state of North Carolina. The laws are evolving and changing. The Supreme Court continues refining what the duty is and the obligation that a restaurant or a bar might have to the individual and ultimately to the person that is injured or killed as a result of that drunk driver's actions. Ultimately, the liability always is obviously with the defendant, the drunk. That's a foregone conclusion. But then tagging or somehow making the bar and or social host responsible depends on a number of different factors. If that is a question, if that's a circumstance, it's certainly one that merits investigation by a competent personal injury attorney.
Okay, now Michael, in a drunk driving accident where there are both civil and criminal charges, does that give the victim additional avenues for compensation? And I ask this because I imagine that at least some of the cases, the drunk driver has no insurance and no assets, which could leave the victim without any means of recovery.
Well, theoretically, the answer is yes. From a practical standpoint, probably the answer is no. From a civil standpoint, even if the defendant doesn't have insurance, oftentimes we're able to find something called uninsured coverage, or if they have limited insurance, underinsured coverage, that in effect steps in the shoes as if that was the coverage of the defendant, the person who caused the accident, the drunk driver. The criminal component, oftentimes you'll hear about the criminal case obviously involving some level of jail time, but also the judge will order some level of compensation or some fine or penalty that will be assessed from the drunk driver to benefit the injured party and or parties. The problem is if they didn't have insurance and they didn't have assets to begin with, that judgment or that fine is generally not collectible. So yes, there is, and also on the civil end there is the punitive aspect, which is covered by some insurance policies, which is you get your compensation for the injuries, your medical bills, lost wages, pain and suffering. But in addition to that, there would be a punitive aspect of the case, which would deal specifically with the fact that the person was drunk and shouldn't have been driving.
Okay. Well, Michael, if someone has specific questions, how can they reach your office?
They can reach us toll-free at 877-333-1000. They can reach us by web at DeMayoLaw.com. And now we have a text capability where they can text the word DeMayo to 333-100, And any of those avenues are potential ways to get in touch with our law firm.
Very good. Michael, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
This is Cindy Speaker for Main Street Law.